The policeman insists that a disabled woman leaves the car, ignoring her explanations. The consequences of his actions will prove unpredictable. Subscribe and share where you are watching this video from. Leah's alarm clock beeped softly, the persistent sound pulling her out of the remnants of a dream she could no longer remember. Her fingers brushed the sleek surface of her smartphone, silencing the noise with practiced ease. She lay there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. The room was small but cozy, with soft golden light filtering through the blinds and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. It was a simple apartment, but it was hers, her space, her sanctuary. She had earned it. Leah turned onto her side and reached for the prosthetic leg beside her bed, carefully attaching it to her body. Each motion was methodical, almost ritualistic now. After years of practice, the process had become second nature. The clinking of the metal joints as she snapped the prosthesis in place felt strangely reassuring. She looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection a reminder of everything she had overcome. Leah had lost both of her legs in a car accident almost 5 years ago. The details of that day were blurred in her memory, but she could still recall the strange silence that had followed the crash. How everything seemed to stop except for the blaring horn and the rush of blood. She had been in the passenger seat, the impact tossing her around like a rag doll. When the world finally settled, she found herself staring at an unfamiliar landscape. But she survived, and that in itself had felt like a victory. Now, every morning, she reminded herself that she wasn't just surviving, she was living. She was thriving. She took a deep breath and pulled herself out of bed, stretching the muscles that had adapted to her new way of moving. Her prosthetic legs had become an extension of herself. She no longer felt their foreignness when she stood. Instead, she felt empowered. She dressed quickly, pulling on a dark pair of jeans and a loose sweater. Leah had learned to dress efficiently, choosing clothes that were comfortable and functional, but still made her feel like herself. Fashion had been the last thing on her mind in the early days after the accident, but now she enjoyed the small victories in how she looked and felt confident despite the stares. After a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, Leah grabbed her keys, checked that her phone was in her bag, and wheeled herself out the door, locking it behind her. Her car was parked just outside, a modified vehicle with special controls and the seat adjusted for her comfort. Driving was one of the things that had given her independence again. At first, she had been terrified to get back behind the wheel, but now it was just another part of her routine. The streets were quiet as she drove, the early morning sun casting golden rays on the world outside. She found peace in these moments, the hum of the engine, the rhythmic motion of her hands on the wheel. Driving had become her moment of solitude, a time when she could let her mind wander. Sometimes, she'd think about the future, about what she wanted to accomplish. Other times, she'd think about the past, about the person she used to be. But today was different. Today, she wasn't thinking about her accident or the pain she'd endured. Today, she was thinking about the meeting she was headed to, a coffee date with a couple of friends. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just a small gathering of people she trusted, people who had been with her through the hardest moments. Still, the thought of seeing them made her smile. Leah loved her friends. They had become her chosen family. They had stood by her when everything had fallen apart, and now they were her support system, her reason to keep fighting. As she navigated through the streets of the city, she could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, but it didn't feel as heavy today. Her friends had a way of making her feel lighter, reminding her of the life she had outside of her struggles. They would joke, they would laugh, and for a few hours, she could forget about the challenges that came with living in a world that sometimes seemed determined to remind her of her differences. When she pulled into the cafe's parking lot, she felt a wave of excitement rush over her. The cafe was one of her favorite places, warm, inviting, with the aroma of fresh coffee and pastries filling the air. She wheeled herself inside, greeted by the familiar faces of her friends. They were sitting at their usual spot near the window, their eyes lighting up when they saw her. Leah, one of them, Jessica, called out, waving enthusiastically. "You made it." Leah smiled, rolling herself over to the table. Wouldn't miss it for the world. As she settled into the chair, She felt a sense of ease wash over her. She had learned to take these moments for what they were: simple, fleeting, but valuable. They were reminders that despite the challenges, she still had joy in her life. And that was enough. They spent the next few hours chatting about everything and nothing: about work, about life, about the small victories that made the struggles worthwhile. Leah listened more than she spoke, soaking in their energy. She wasn't just a passive participant in their conversations, though. She shared her own stories too, about the small achievements in her life, how she had learned to navigate the world differently, how she had pushed through fear to live the way she wanted. The day felt like a warm embrace, and as the afternoon wore on, she realized how much she needed these moments of normalcy. Despite everything, she had found a rhythm. She had learned to move forward, even when it felt like the world was trying to hold her back. But as she wheeled herself back to her car later that afternoon, something caught her eye: a flash of blue and red lights in the rearview mirror. It was a police car, following her a little too closely for comfort. Leah's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she wondered if she had done something wrong. But she quickly dismissed the thought. She hadn't broken any laws. She hadn't been speeding. Still, her nerves tingled with an unfamiliar unease. She pulled over to the side of the road, her palms suddenly clammy. The car stopped behind hers, and the police officer inside began to slowly exit. Leah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, not today. She glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. She looked fine. She felt fine. But something about the way the officer was walking toward her made her uneasy. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the sense of dread that began to creep in was undeniable. The officer reached her car, his silhouette framed by the harsh glow of the patrol car's lights. Leah took a steadying breath and rolled down her window. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice gruff. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Leah's mind raced. The officer's tone was firm, but something in his eyes made her feel uneasy. "I'm afraid I can't get out, officer," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm disabled. I don't have the physical ability to step out of the car." The officer didn't respond immediately. He paused, then stepped closer to her window, leaning down slightly as if to scrutinize her. "I said step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Leah's heart began to beat faster. Something wasn't right. She knew it. "I can't," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I really can't. I don't have legs. I can't stand." The officer's face tightened, his gaze turning cold. "You're not above the law, ma'am. I'm asking you to get out of the car." Leah felt a chill run through her. She hadn't expected this, not today. Not when she was just trying to get home. Something told her that today wasn't going to be ordinary at all. The officer's glare felt like a weight on her chest, suffocating in its intensity. Leah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale, a subtle tremor starting in her fingers. She had always prided herself on handling difficult situations with grace, but this felt different, wrong. She had been stopped by the police before, plenty of times, but something about this officer's demeanor made her stomach twist. This wasn't routine. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop. "Ma'am, I'm not asking again," the officer repeated, his voice now sharp and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle." Leah swallowed hard. She was used to confrontation, used to people doubting her abilities or making assumptions based on her appearance. But the force with which he spoke, the lack of empathy in his eyes, it all felt like a trap. Her mind raced for a way out. She could explain again. She could plead. But would it even matter? This officer wasn't looking for understanding. He wasn't listening. "I told you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I can't step out. I have prosthetics. I can't walk." Her words felt as though they were sinking into a void, her voice sounding hollow in her own ears. The officer didn't respond, only stepped closer to the window, looming over her in a way that made the car feel smaller, tighter. The sounds of the city, the hum of passing cars, the distant chatter of pedestrians, seemed to fade into a strange silence, like the world itself was holding its breath. The officer was now so close she could smell the faint scent of his cologne and see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles coiled under his uniform. Leah felt her heart hammering in her chest. She could almost hear it over the roar of panic building in her mind. He wasn't letting up. His hand rested casually on his holster. But his stance was aggressive, too aggressive for someone who should have been following protocol. "Get out of the car now, or I'll have to assist you," he said. His words clipped, his eyes narrowing. Assist her? Leah's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what that meant. He was threatening to use force. She had been here before. In a sense, not in this exact situation, but in countless interactions with people who assumed she was weak, that she could be controlled easily. But this wasn't just about her disability. This was about something deeper, something more sinister. She could feel it in the officer's body language, in the way his hand hovered near his weapon. He wasn't just mad at her for not following orders. This was something more personal, something more visceral. "Please," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not resisting you. I can't get out of the car. Just let me show you my ID and registration, and we can move on." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes flicked to the side briefly, then back to her, as if he were deciding something. A flash of impatience passed over his face. "You don't need to show me anything, ma'am," he said, leaning closer. His breath was sharp, the edge of his words like a slap in the face. "I said get out of the vehicle now." Leah felt the cold grip of fear clutch at her gut. This wasn't just a stop. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. She had heard stories, horrible, chilling stories of people in situations like hers who hadn't made it out alive, or who had been brutalized in the name of order. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense that everything was about to escalate. He wasn't just going to let her go. He wasn't going to back down. Her mind was racing. Her phone, it was still on the seat next to her. She could record this. She could make sure there was proof of what was happening. But she didn't have time to think it through completely. Suddenly, the officer reached for the door handle. He yanked it open with one quick motion, and before Leah could react, he was tugging at her arm, pulling her forward. The shock of it was enough to freeze her for a moment. Pain flared in her chest, the force of his grip bruising her skin. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Stop," Leah gasped, her voice tight with a mix of fear and disbelief. "You can't do this. I told you." But he didn't stop. The officer was lifting her out of her seat now, pulling her with surprising strength, yanking her toward the door. Leah's heart raced, and she felt panic rise in her throat. She couldn't fight him. She couldn't get away from him. "Let go of me," she shouted, trying to twist away. But her body was powerless against his strength. Her prosthetics, already partially dislodged from the motion, were now completely twisted out of place, dangling loosely as he dragged her out. The clattering sound of the leg falling to the pavement was like a distant echo. But to Leah, it felt like the world had broken open. She could feel the weight of her legs pulling her down, the stares of the people around them, the sharp edges of humiliation sinking in deeper with every second. "Stop it," Leah screamed, her voice raw now, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. "Shut up," the officer snapped, his grip tightening. His face was hard, devoid of any empathy, any understanding. His jaw clenched as he struggled to pull her out completely. For a moment, everything seemed to blur, the pain, the fear, the onlookers who had gathered, some with phones in their hands, others too shocked to move. The world felt far away, like Leah was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The officer's hands were on her arms, pulling her forcibly from the car. She was losing control, the very ground beneath her slipping away as he dragged her into the street. Someone shouted from the crowd, another voice joining the chaos. "Stop! What are you doing to her?" a man called out, rushing forward. "She can't walk. You can't just drag her out like that." But the officer didn't care. He was relentless. His eyes narrowed with authority, as though Leah's resistance was an affront to him. The crowd murmured, some shouting, some filming, but it didn't seem to matter. The officer was determined to carry out his orders, no matter what. "Move along, people," he barked at the witnesses, but his words had no power to silence the outrage that was building. Leah's mind was still spinning. the adrenaline flooding her system. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't going to let this man break her. She forced herself to think. Her phone was still recording. She had to get it to someone. Anyone who could help. She had to make sure there was a record of this. She could see the crowd now. People were taking out their phones. This wasn't just happening to her anymore. This was happening in front of others. And they were watching, recording. Someone would hear. Someone would do something. Here. Leah managed to choke out, her voice hoarse as she reached toward the closest person, a woman standing near the sidewalk, her phone in hand. Please, take my phone. Keep recording. The woman looked stunned, but she nodded quickly, stepping forward to grab the phone from Leah's hand. The officer barely seemed to notice, his focus entirely on dragging Leah further away from the car. Get off me! Leah screamed again, the sound tearing through her throat. She could feel her body begin to go limp, the pain and fear too much to bear. But then, through the haze of panic, a sudden flash of clarity hit her. The cameras, the people watching, the evidence was in motion, and there was no way this could go unnoticed. The officer was still pulling her, but Leah wasn't alone anymore. The sound of sirens wailing in the distance grew louder, cutting through the chaos. The crowd had grown, and Leah could hear the mix of disbelief, anger, and fear in their voices. Some were shouting for the officer to stop. Others were calling for help. The tension in the air,